Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today I'll show you how to make this cute bolero. Now I don't really know how to pronounce this word properly, so I'll just pronounce in front of the camera for a little bit until you realize what I'm talking about. Bolero. I can't say it, can I? It's hopeless. Okay, I won't say that word ever again. So, first, let's see what you're going to need for this item of clothing. I'll show you the pieces that you need to cut out right after my lord and master decides to move his furry butt. I'll try negotiations, maybe a bribe in form of a scratch, maybe that will work. Let's see, if all else fails, I'll just try to scoot his butt. No, oh, sorry. I'm so sorry, sir. Could you please just, oh, thank you. There we go. Okay, once you're done cutting out, you should have your back, your front piece, your sleeves, as well as the collar and the bias tape. I chose to make my own tape, and I'm going to link the tutorial which I used in the link below. It was a really good tutorial. The first thing I did was interface my collar. Now I decided to interface only half of it, but in truth, after I was done, I realized I could have interfaced the whole collar because my fabric was so lightweight anyway, so it wouldn't have made a big difference. So if you're working with a lightweight fabric, I think it's okay, and it's actually easier to interface both sides. And next, I will press the bias tape. Now, first I press it in half. I'll press the seam allowance after I have ironed the bias tape to the bolero. You'll see what I mean later. So the first thing we are going to do at the sewing machine is sew our darts. I start with the back of the item that shall remain nameless for the rest of the tutorial, and yeah, so I make the darts in the back and in the front piece, and then I move on to the sleeves, which also have elbow darts, which are lovely because they facilitate the movement of the arm. They're really comfortable. So now that we are done with our darts, I will connect the bodice front and back at the shoulder seam. So I start with one shoulder seam and then the other shoulder seam, making sure that I put back and front pieces right sides together. And now I will connect front and back bolero at the side seams, making sure that the dart is facing downwards. Now you can see me sewing the elbow darts on the sleeve pieces. The next step is sewing the sleeves. So you fold the sleeve on itself, right sides together, and you sew the underarm seam. And once you're done with that, it's a perfect time to take your pieces to your serger and serge the raw seams. I waited before I went to the overlock until I had most of my major seams done. So my sleeves were done and my bodice was done as well. And I'll return to the overlock later once I have the sleeves set into the arm seam. Now that all the seams, all the major seams are done, I'll go to my ironing board and press both the seams and the darts. I didn't go earlier because I wanted to save time, so I do everything in batches. I first sew as much as I can at the sewing machine, then overlock everything that I can, and then I go to the ironing board and press. Now before I set in the sleeves, I run a few gathering stitches, so those are long length stitches at the top of the sleeve piece. I usually do 3 gathering stitches. You can do just 2, but I feel like the 3 gathering stitches give really even and neat gathers. So that's up to you. So now the part I was quite frankly dreading a little bit because I've never done anything like that before. We are going to sew the bias tape to the bolero to encase the seams in the bias tape. So what we do is put the bias tape and the bolero front right sides together. At the bottom corner, I have marked 1 centimeter away from each edge because I am using 1 centimeter seam allowance. Perhaps you're using 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, so then mark 1.5 centimeter from each edge. Then when you get to the bottom, you have to backstitch and stop. And this is a funny part, you have to fold the bias tape, make like a little corner, and then start sewing on the bottom edge of the front piece. So it creates like a little triangle pocket. It's really well illustrated in the pattern instructions. I'm sorry I cannot give you a better description, but honestly it was confusing even for me at first, but luckily it turns out really, really well, even if you don't know what you're doing like I did. So anyway, now you'll be sewing all the way around the bottom of your bolero, and then you'll come to the second corner. I'm marking my corners again. I should have done that ahead of time, but I didn't expect I'll need them. Turns out they're really helpful. So again, we are going to get to that seam mark, in my case 1 centimeter, backstitch, stop, and fold the bias tape again. Now I was a little bit confused going back the other way around because you look at the corner from the opposite side, so to speak, but it works out just fine. You get again fold it upon itself so it creates that triangle, and then you see your bias tape is again parallel to your to the edge of the bodice front, and just continue to the very top. Now that we are done attaching the bias tape to the bolero, it's a good time to press it. So just to make sure it stays flat. So we are ironing the bias tape away from that seam, making sure that everything is flat. And when I got to the bottom corner, I decided to turn the bolero around and flip the bias tape out just to press that corner, because I thought it would make it a bit easier to get a really neat corner. And then I just fold that bias tape on the corner on the inside of the bias tape, because that will help me make sure that everything stays flat when I go over the top of the bias tape with the iron. Now I flip the bolero to the wrong side, and on the wrong side I turn up the seam allowance of the bias tape up by 1 centimeter and press it. So basically I want to make sure that the edge of the bias tape is right above that seam that we made when we attached the bias tape to the bolero, because after that we will take our bolero to the sewing machine and top stitch the bias tape down, and we want to make sure we catch the bias tape on the inside in our seam. Now I am at the sewing machine again, and I'm basically making a stitch in the ditch to attach the bias tape to the bolero. So I am top stitching the bias tape exactly on the line of the previous stitching that I've done. So you shouldn't be able to see the stitching on the white part or like on the main bodice, nor on the bias tape on the outside. It should be right in that ditch that was created by the first stitch that we did, attaching the bias tape to the bolero. And now I'm just going over it, making sure that I'm catching the bias tape below. So the bias tape below should be right on that mark of the stitch that we did previously. Now, before I show you the next part, which is attaching the collar to the neckline, I just have to say that I made a mistake with this part, because what I should have done was folding the collar in half and stitching the ends together, then flipping the collar out to the right side. I have forgotten that, and I went straight into attaching the collar to the neckline, which was a mistake, but I decided to keep my mistakes in, because that just goes to show you can save any situation pretty much. So what I did here is I attached the right side of the collar to the right side of the neckline, and I stitched it together. Then I went to the ironing board and I pressed my collar up. So I pressed that seam I just made up, so the collar is flat. And at this stage, you can only wonder that I still didn't get it, that I made a mistake and I should have unstitched the collar. But no, I kept going and I folded the collar in half, and I turned up the seam allowance on the other side of the collar up. So I planned, when I go to top stitch, that seam allowance would be already up. So I would just top stitch the collar in a similar way that I top stitched or stitched the bias tape using stitch in the ditch from the outside. But I suppose at this stage something must have clicked in my brain, and I must have been like, oh, there's one more edge in here on the side of the collar. Oh, yeah, so that should have already been closed, but I'm trying to save the situation and I'm stitching those sides together now. And I'm going to proceed to fold the corner, and I'll flip the collar to the right side as I should have done at the very beginning before I stitched the collar to the right side of the neckline. Okay, and now through all the troubles and issues that I've created for myself, I have finally arrived at the last stage of sewing the collar together, which is basically top stitching the collar to the neckline. So as you can see, I have already pressed that seam allowance up, so it's already aligned with the neckline. So I'm sure that when I top stitch it from the inside, that stitch is not going to show on the outside of the bodice. Now I will be attaching sleeve to the bodice. Turn the bodice to the wrong side and I attach the sleeve into the arm side, making sure that the sleeve and my bodice are right sides together. And then I can put a pin in the most crucial points like side seams as well as the very top of the sleeve and shoulder seam. And once I have everything in place, I can gather the sleeve top to make sure that it fits perfectly into the arm side. Once my gathers are ready, I can start attaching the sleeve to the bodice. All we have to do now is sew the sleeve to the bodice. When I get to the gathers, I make sure to straighten them, make sure that they lie flat. Once I have attached both sleeves to the bodice, I'm taking them to my overlock and I'm overlocking both arm sides. Now I have to attach bias tape to the lower edge of the sleeve and encase that seam in the bias tape. So I do that by folding a little bit of bias tape and then putting bias tape and sleeve right sides together and sewing them together at 1 centimeter seam allowance. And I'm sewing all around the lower sleeve edge until I get to the bit of the bias tape I started with, and I sew a little bit extra. So instead of stopping right at that point where the previous bit starts, I give myself a few millimeters overlap. Then I turn up that seam allowance, and as you can see, I will have to fold it by half, just fold it up just like I did with the previous bias tape that we were attaching to the bodice. I'm going to the ironing board and I'm pressing down that seam allowance on the inside of the sleeve. So when I'm back at the sewing machine, I can just go straight up to sewing from the right side, sewing the bias tape from the right side, making sure that I'm catching the bias tape underneath. And when I get to that middle point where the bias tape started, I just want to make sure that there is no raw edge of the bias tape sticking out, that everything is folded upon itself. Sometimes it's a bit finicky this point, especially if your bias tape is as lightweight as mine. But I just take my time making sure that everything is where I want it to be, and then I continue on sewing, top stitching all around the lower sleeve edge until the whole seam is encased by the bias tape. And once I'm done with that, I go back to that middle point where both bias tape ends meet, and I just top stitch over those ends. So yeah, I make sure that those ends, that the bias tape is flat there, that there are no raw edges sticking out, and I top stitch the bias tape together. And that's it for this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching.